arteries are blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart. So one main thing you should think about, or basically a way to remember this, is that the word arteries starts with the letter A, and it carries blood away from the heart. So all arteries carry blood away from the heart. As we mentioned before, arteries have a thick wall to them, and that's because the heart is pumping blood directly into the arteries, and so they have a high pressure that they have to deal with. And so this thick wall helps to keep the artery from kind of busting open as it's experiencing that pressure. Now we can see here that we mentioned that the main blood vessel leaving the heart is the ascending aorta. And then it branches into arteries that service all the, or most of the major tissues and organs in the body. So you can see that it branches off into arteries that go to the arms, it extends down and branches off into arteries that go to the kidneys and the liver, and you've got some that go down into the legs. And so all of these arteries are just branching into smaller and smaller structures. The arteries keep branching into really small arteries called arterioles. And arterioles are the blood vessels that deliver blood directly into a capillary bed. And we mentioned before about the vasodilation and vasoconstriction. And so arterioles can help control which capillary beds get more blood and which get less blood. And that's because the arterioles, if they vasodilate, it means that it opens up so that more blood can get to the capillary bed. If the arteriole vasoconstricts, it limits how much blood can get to the capillary bed, and that blood would be directed elsewhere. So this is one way that our body can direct blood away from tissues that don't need it at the moment towards tissues that do need it. Because remember, blood is transporting nutrients and oxygen around the body so that the cells can make energy. Capillaries are microscopic vessels where gas and nutrient exchange actually occurs. And this nutrient and gas exchange occurs between the blood and the tissues. So you would have cells and extracellular fluid outside the capillary, and the capillary would have the blood and the nutrients carried in the blood here. There are 3 different types of capillaries, and the main difference between them is just how leaky they are. So in some areas, we need capillaries that are really, really leaky. So you can see these sinusoid ones here. They have really big gaps in the walls of the capillaries. This allows for rapid exchange of nutrients as well as bigger things like proteins and cells that can leak out of the capillaries here. Fenestrated are kind of intermediate in that some stuff can leak out, other stuff can't. And then continuous capillaries are the least leaky, so that there are still some things that can diffuse out of the continuous capillaries, but not as much as what would diffuse or leave the fenestrated or sinusoid capillaries. And as we mentioned before, most of the major tissues and organs in the body have a capillary bed. So the purpose of the blood is that arteries deliver blood with oxygen and nutrients to the capillary bed. The capillary beds drop off those nutrients and oxygen into the tissues. The cells use those nutrients and oxygens to make energy in the form of ATP. And then the waste products, which includes carbon dioxide and things like urea, uric acid, ammonia, and other stuff, is then it then diffuses back into the capillary bed, where it travels through the veins back to the heart. Now, in capillary beds, we have an exchange in both directions. Like we said, some stuff leaves the capillary, other stuff goes into the capillary. And this includes some of the fluid associated with the capillary. So one kind of form of exchange is called filtration. And filtration happens typically on the side of the capillary bed closest to the arterioles. So if we go back a slide, this would be happening right here. So this is where the arterioles are delivering blood into the capillary beds, and this is where filtration would occur. So what happens is that hydrostatic pressure, which is just the pressure of a fluid enclosed in a space, and in this case it's blood pressure. So your blood pressure helps to push fluids and different substances that are dissolved or suspended in the plasma out of the capillary into the tissue fluid, so that the cells can get the nutrients that it needs. And this is controlled by how much blood is entering the capillary bed. So if the arterioles are vasodilated, it would mean more blood is coming in here, which would mean more pressure, which would mean more filtration. Now, on the venule side of the capillary bed, you have reabsorption. So this is where some stuff gets reabsorbed or kind of sucked back into the capillary. And so, especially with water, we have a lot of water that gets pushed out at the arterial end, and then some of that water gets reabsorbed at the venule end of the capillary bed. Now, overall, filtration happens more than reabsorption. So we have more, especially fluid, that leaves the capillary beds than we have fluid that gets reabsorbed. So this means that we end up with more fluid in our tissue spaces than we do in the blood. So there's a net loss of fluid out of the capillary beds in the tissues. Now, this would be a problem, except for we have this cool kind of system called the lymphatic system. And the lymphatic system drains the extra water away from the tissues and delivers it back into the bloodstream at a different location. Now, if there's something wrong with the lymphatic system, you can end up with swelling, and that's because you have excess water that builds up in the tissues outside of the capillaries. But as long as your lymphatic system is working properly, it will drain that excess water away, and you won't notice that it's there. Now remember that capillaries drain into venules, and then the venules converge to form larger and larger veins. And you can see that most of the arteries have a corresponding vein. So for example, there is a renal artery that goes to the kidneys, and then a renal vein that drains blood away from the kidneys. So veins conduct blood to the heart. So all of these veins here are sending blood back to the heart. We mentioned before that they have a thinner wall than arteries. They also have a larger lumen, and they withstand less pressure. That's because the pressure kind of spreads out and dissipates as the blood is moving through the arteries and the arterioles and the capillary beds. So one thing that veins have, especially in the lower extremities like the legs, are valves. And these valves help to keep the blood moving in one direction, because you can imagine you've got not much pressure by the time, let's say, the blood gets down to your big toe, but that blood has to make its way all the way back up to the heart, and it's got to fight against gravity to do so. So the valves help to ensure that the blood is moving up through the veins in the legs and not falling back down towards the ankles. So this picture here kind of shows you the valves. So as blood is pushed up through the vein, the valve is opened, like you can see here. And then when that blood kind of gets pulled back down by gravity, it causes the valve to close. So it means that the blood moves little by little up through the veins, and the valves help to keep it from kind of falling back down towards the feet, for example, when the heart is at rest and there's not as much pressure. There are certain things that kind of help this along other than just the heart, though. So for example, we call this the skeletal muscle pump. So when you contract the skeletal muscles, for example, in your legs, the contraction of the skeletal muscles actually helps to increase blood flow through those veins. And so it does that by kind of helping to milk the blood back from or up through a valve into the next kind of segment of the vein. And so if you're ever in a situation where maybe you're sitting down for a long period of time. For example, when you're on an airplane, if you're flying to Australia and you're stuck on an airplane for 14 hours, one thing that they recommend you do is every so often to just contract the muscles in your legs. And that helps to keep your blood moving, and it keeps your ankles from getting swollen, and it keeps, or it helps prevent blood clots from forming. We also have something called a respiratory pump, where breathing changes pressure in your thoracic cavity. That also helps to squeeze blood through veins. So sometimes if you're feeling lightheaded or maybe your blood flow isn't working properly, if you take a couple of deep breaths, that will help to get the blood moving through the blood vessels and back to the heart. Now, as we mentioned, in some cases you can end up with swelling, and that can be due to too much fluid in the interstitial fluid, or it can be due to blood pooling in the veins. So this especially happens in the ankles. And one thing that can cause this is something called varicose veins, or I guess varicose veins is what they call maybe the symptom. Because in some cases, those valves don't work properly. And so when the valves don't work properly, they allow the blood to fall back down towards the feet. And varicose veins are most common in legs, but they can occur in other parts of the body as well. Varicose veins can be itchy and painful, but for the most part, it's a cosmetic issue that some people find unsightly and they want to get it fixed. They are more common in women, especially women that are pregnant or have been pregnant. There are different treatments for varicose veins. You can use support hose or socks. These are especially recommended if you're going on like a long plane flight, or if you're on your feet a lot during the day, or if you're having problems with swelling, because it helps to push that blood back up towards the heart. They can also do surgery to remove them, or they can use lasers to kind of make them less obvious, so that if you're worried about the cosmetic aspect of it, the laser surgery can make it disappear. And it's not a big deal to remove some veins, because you've got multiple routes that blood can flow from a capillary bed back to the heart. So if you're just removing some small veins, there are going to be other routes for that blood to get back to where it needs to be. Now, obviously, if you remove too many veins, or if you remove a major vein, that could cause a problem. But typically, the smaller veins involved with varicose veins can be removed without there being a problem with blood flow.